first thing that needs to be addressed before anything else. I do not support pre-alphas, alphas, or betas of any kind. I do not endorse incomplete products. This practice seems to be an ongoing issue within the gaming industry. How about this? Buy a car that is missing a door or seats or
What the hell?
manufacturer's response. Don't worry, we'll send out to you at some point. We don't know when, and as you agree to our terms, we have no obligation to fulfill that. Oh, and by the way, we can remove anything from the car at any point without warning. We are still designing it. Things might change, but sometime. This game was a gift from someone who thought I might enjoy it. You know who you are. Shipbreaker Hardspace is, isn't, and be. What it is, what it isn't, what it could be. First time I ever seriously thought about the possibility of deep space salvage is when I was watching the movie Aliens for the first time. There was a throwaway line at the beginning of the movie.
There goes our salvage, guys.
There it is. That is all that was said. That one sentence introduced me to the idea of space junking. From that moment on, you'd be amazed at how the smallest, most inconsequential thing you don't even notice can affect you. The reason why this is so, at least for me, is because there is so much necessary for a civilization to be at a point where space junking is not only possible but practical. We are talking about decades upon decades of efficient space vessel abandonment compounding year after year. So let's look at the game itself and see what the devs have to offer and their vision of space salvage. An exercise in dismantling and harvesting spaceships of the exploration and utility class. To get an idea of what this actually looks like, we need to take a look at the ships of today being salvaged on the beach. The moment I saw this game, I knew where the idea came from. You can see the large sections of the ships being removed, panels being cut and then dragged into position, just like the panels in Shipbreaker. The tether system in-game is very much like the tether system on the beach. They are almost identical. The difference is, one being in a gravity well, and the other being outside the well. The devs making Shipbreaker might have had this game originally playing out on Earth in a shipbreaking yard, disassembling ocean-going vessels. However, the difference in 0G and 1G is pretty dramatic. In fact, it's fundamental to the game mechanics. The movement, tether system, hazards. Just look at movement in 0G. All degrees of movement are possible and accessible at any time. In a 1G environment, you would have to deal with traversing ledges, climbing over obstacles. All object collisions need to be considered because of gravity. Objects will have weight instead of just mass, friction, tensile strength, inertia. Most of the game, if in 1G, would simply be moving to and around the ship. It would severely limit your ability to approach the ship in whatever way you would wish. Shipbreaker would become very specific. You can't rightly cut out the floor panel you need to stand on. The speculation is that if the devs started the game out on Earth, the obstacle of movement was overcome by changing the game to a 0G environment, outer space. So we have a game in micro/no G, dicing up ships with low Earth orbit as a backdrop. Now why would we want to do this? Our total motivation for doing all of this is to pay off debt. Pay off debt. This is what you call it. The only idea less thought out than paying debt would be nothing at all. This isn't a finished game, perhaps hardly even a game at all. This is a game mechanic demo. made by a small group of people. It isn't well funded or thought out. It has a problem that most unfinished games have: content and available narrative to us. Because of the small dev team working on it, this game may never get what it really needs: an immersive story and lots of variation in content. The variety in content could suffer just fine if the game physics were super rich. And by that I mean a sandbox physics engine for material processing and disintegration via thermal, electric, and mechanical at hyper-realistic levels. Some gimmicks like NVIDIA physics, that type of particle simulation would be very fitting here. Take rendering simulation like PhysX and then apply it to real-world metal processing. If that level of physics was present, it wouldn't matter how few ships were in the game. A physics engine like that would more than make up for the difference in the lack of variety in the ships to salvage. There would be a huge array of choices to experiment with the in-game engine. Watching ferrous metal being destroyed by high-speed tools is very satisfying. Effects like this would be a byproduct of a really great physics engine. Shipbreaker is not a loot and shoot, where the game is based on odds or a new skin every week. That isn't going to cut it here. Let's be precise. Changing the paint job on a ship doesn't make it more better. It provides absolutely no change to the baseline experience. This type of game needs a big committed dev team, basically AAA status. Without that, the solid foundation this game is standing on will never make it to ground level. As I said, space salvaging is something that has interested me for quite some time. The fact that in the Shipbreaker universe space travel has developed enough to make space junking possible is interesting in and of itself. Shipbreaker isn't without concern or need. Now, to be truthful, I believe I skipped the introduction video during the first launch of the game after I installed it on my computer. I couldn't find a way to play it again. My entire Shipbreaker experience is here. I never played outside of the captured content, so I do not have context for this game. Now, that gave me the ability to think of my own. What I'm about to say might be close to the actual Shipbreaker story, I don't know. I haven't spent any time looking into it. Earth is on the losing side of an interstellar war. The half-century war has ended, and this is all that remains. Earth has been contaminated, irradiated, laid to complete and utter waste. Streams of tar and plastic grow from trees now. The handful of humans left on live in endless despair. No chance of survival. No chance of being found. Earth can no longer be used for supplies or raw material. Most of the raw elements in Earth were mined decades ago to further the futile war. What is left in low Earth orbit is all that remains of humanity. During the war, heavy manufacturing centers were the first areas targeted after military installations. All of Earth's manufacturing infrastructure, power, regulatory, and ecosystems were destroyed beyond repair. This is why the survivors look to salvage as much as they can from everything, from every ship. If you're a spacefaring race, and you are at war with another, targeting the surface of a planet extraterrestrially gives you many more options, such as realistic kill vehicles, than to try and hit a small satellite traveling at orbital velocities around said planet. This is one reason why the LEO industries in Shipbreaker were still intact, and all terrestrial-bound industries were lost. In the Shipbreaker universe, Earth has outposts in the Sol system, as well as outposts in distant star systems. But at the current technological state Earth is at, we no longer have any way to get to those other outposts. Humanity that survived is scattered and cut off from each other. We are rebuilding to make contact with the other survivors. The rail cannon in the game could be a big part of this in several ways. Could be for communication, resources, travel, defense, offense, mutually assured destruction. The priority is to bring the rail cannon back online first. Then use the salvage material to rebuild a fleet of ships. We are trying to survive, maintain a civilization. Makes for a more interesting motivation than paying off debt. Debt wouldn't exist at this point in time. There isn't enough free time or security for people to figure out a way to scam each other. Live or die, that's the only choice. This would have freed humanity from. So there are some things to be thankful for. Now that we have a narrative, a few of the finer points to highlight within the current Shipbreaker. There would be more than one shipyard. Each one would have different benefits and caveats. Each shipyard may be only able to process certain materials or certain size ships. Issues with power and other utilities until upgraded. A tech tree for shipyards. There would be salvage opportunities that would require us to travel to the ship, i.e. the ship is so large that it can't be towed back, or the location that the ship is at is dangerous. The amount of space on our ship that we are using to travel to the wrecked ship is small, so you will have to choose what tools to bring with you. The wrecked ship could be beached on a planet, crashed into an asteroid belt, or just adrift in space. If the crashed ship is on a planet, different gravity, weather, hazards, nuclear or antimatter leaks that had to be dealt with or contained. These would most likely be in the Sol system at this point in time, unless the game offered us a choice to start somewhere else. On these long excursions to the wrecked ships, only certain equipment or material can be salvaged because of the limited space on the ship you are using to get there. You might have to cut the wrecked ship up to bring it back in sections to further process it in the shipyard. You might have to dump your own cargo to haul back more important salvage from the wrecked ship. You may have to cut parts of your own ship out to make room for something more valuable to bring back. Then you have to weld new support structures from the wrecked ship to your ship so you can then make the trip back. And if you do it poorly, your ship will be blown apart in transit and everything will be lost. We could be sent out and have to salvage while under attack. Just because the war is over doesn't mean it's over. We have to choose what to salvage, and the longer it takes, the more human lives or resources are lost. Manpower is a very finite resource as well. These actions would all be tied together with an overarching storyline that would be affected by what we do or not. Now, this would require a massive investment in the narrative, and that can be easily done. Have certain ships salvage necessary for specific goals. These goals would change. Military ships for weapons, industrial medical ships for material technology. Depending on what we, the players, salvage, can change the direction the game goes, such as more military tech would lead to more offense and defense situations. The big one, to me, is finding ships from different alien races, which would open up another huge opportunity. This idea would specifically affect what tools you can use to salvage. Maybe none of the Terran tools we currently have would work, so we have to find or develop new salvage tools to deal with the alien matter. We could have special guest ships like the Nostromo, and you know what it would have on board. Or we are sent out to salvage an entire space station like Sevastopol or the ISS. The space station could be in a decaying orbit around a star. Because of the decaying orbit, we would be affected by the massive tidal forces acting on the station, as well as having a ticking clock to contend with. Some of the salvage could go to different places for a multitude of reasons. Some people may be bidding on your salvage, but their hidden agenda for wanting it could be for scrupulous reasons. Maybe they will just try to take the salvage from you, again all interacting with the progression of the narrative. Finding enemy ships that could be salvaged for intel, or find weaknesses in their defense or offense, their tech abilities, which would lead to humanity finding out what it needs to know in order to survive another encounter with the alien race that wasted Earth the first time. And if humanity doesn't find what it needs to know, game over. You and humanity are dead. Your save file would be deleted. with no way to inject a new saved file or recover it. You have to start all over again. You were just too much of a... To give an example of a massive game narrative with just the smallest of content, just look at the Sega Genesis game Starflight. Hugely innovative at the time, incredible about what could be done in that game. Instead of salvaging ships and material in Starflight, you were mining raw elements. The idea of the dangers in space travel are really well displayed in that game. In the beginning of the game, you are absolutely pathetic. I read somewhere it took the developers of that game 2 years to figure out a compression algorithm that would allow the Starflight game to fit on existing Sega Genesis carts. That's how big it was. That is one game that should very carefully be remade. Now, of course, the Shipbreaker story wouldn't be linear. There would be multiple ways for the story to progress. There would be multiple endings. In a short amount of time, we can create an entire universe for this game solely based on the perspective and mechanics of a space junker. Another area for improvement are the tools being used for scrapping. Now, I don't know how much the devs have been exposed to as far as heavy industry, but I'm surmising they never actually were. That's not an issue, that just is. I'm going to showcase some of the issues presented because of this. First and foremost is sound. Heavy industry is very loud, very dangerous. The sound has to show that. Since we are not actually doing the work, it's a game. Some important sensations cannot be conveyed. The sounds used in this game have to be dense and vicious. You need to hear the power in what you are doing. You need to feel the violence in your hands. The sounds used in this game have to be dense and vicious. You need to hear the power in what you are doing. Feel the violence in your hands. Here's the current split saw sound. Here's a quick sound thrown together to change the way it feels. First sound was kind of soft, wet, too many curves, very blue-green. Sounds like it's a game. Now the second is very cutting, violent, perhaps even abrasive. You need to feel empowered when using it. You just want to go out there and slice everything and everyone up. Now if you're going to make a game about heavy industry, to tap into a relatively unused demographic, you better be able to deliver. You wouldn't want to sell an attempt at a realistic racing game to a professional race car driver that was developed by a city bus driver. It's just a different experience. Unless you were going for that ironic city bus driver's interpretation of a professional racing game. As for the scrapping furnaces in the game for salvage and metal, those can be tremendously improved. Currently, they are basically nothing but a big open square. The demarcation point is wrong, as mass on the edge of the red line where the furnace is would transfer infrared radiation, which in turn would travel and collect in the object and begin heating it up. Today, nothing happens in the game. The material sitting on that line can sit there for eternity.
Wind blows, fire burns.
Metal melts. Instead, we should see an electric arc furnace. Have you ever heard an electric arc furnace in full operation? This is what we should be seeing. This is a big dramatic difference, much more interesting. If we could spend time just throwing things into the EAF just to see what happens to different substances, how material collects and accumulates inside the furnace. Huge quantities of steel mixed with carbon and silica glass would behave differently than if we were just sending straight iron in. Could go a step further and have different EAFs. AC or DC powered electrodes, different sizes, specialization of specific materials, a tech tree for furnaces. Of all the clips I've seen of an electric arc furnace, I have never heard it captured correctly because of how insane it really sounds, let alone a blast furnace. Things like this in the game would really help with the immersion. Having an EAF in the game would not only be impressive, and perhaps a first to render in-game, but things like ray tracing and HDR would really add depth and realism, perhaps even excitement to some. After all, I think we are going for science fiction, not fantasy. Next is the collection barge. This isn't too involved today. Launch items down to collect, it clears after the shift. Earlier in the game's development cycle, the barge wasn't cleared until you finished the salvage operations, either by abandoning the ship or selecting a new one. With this, it could be changed to allow smaller items, such as computer terminals, electronic devices, utility equipment, and other such things to be collected elsewhere. There could be gravitational or magnetic conveyor system around the shipyard to move items along. The barge seems like it would remain for larger items, reactor, thruster, nacelles, blast chambers. There are plenty of tools, fiction and non-fiction, that could be added to the game, such as plasma torch, gas torch, carbon arc gouging, rotary and reciprocating saws, some form of a solid plasma blade, or even a solid diamond chainsaw blade. And all these would have multiple ways to interact with everything else in the game. Different material for different tools, different levels of splash damage, different rates of heat transfer when using gas, plasma, or arc type. Each of these would have their own unique kind of splash damage. Some plasma or arc type are going to need a metal surface to start transferring the current to begin cutting. Gas type cutters would go through anything, but then again it would be pretty messy. There would be different gases that you could use, such as finally unlocking Dicyanoacetylene, giving us a working temperature of over 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Not to mention the temperature of the gas burning changes depending on the atmosphere, the gravity, oxygen amount, velocity, volume, and on and on. This echoes back to all the possibilities of having an amazing physics engine in-game. We could even have some sort of handheld water jet cutter and have options to mix different types of material downstream. This would have all of the positives and negatives with this type of system. Limited supply length, weight, not portable, would have to be fixed to specific yards. The game kind of has some of these things today, and it's a good start, but material science is quite complex, and it's very hard to make it convincing in-game. This would be a good use of all those computer cores we have today. Of course, we would want RPG-esque elements such as tech trees, research paths, ending options for the game. The game currently has some of this today, but it needs to be expanded upon. Sign if I can't, Lee. Co-op for the campaign, as described earlier, would really open up the game mechanics as well, dividing up work, having to travel to pick up different tools or fly back items or material to be processed. Cutting ships with multiple people concurrently would make it very interesting. Hazards would play out differently in co-op. Someone could become trapped from falling debris if you're in a gravity field, and you have to cut them out. Engagement with enemies, competing factions, and alien encounters. Some helpful, some hurtful, some forgiving, and some that require you. It is a good game. It is based on areas of science I have more than a passing interest in, so this was nothing new to me. The application, however, was. This game is worth looking into, maybe not in and of itself, but of a future that could be. The worst part of the game is also the best part, the huge potential behind the relatively unique application of a specific mechanic. This was my experience.